All right, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you enjoyed your lunch and the poster presentations. We will now go ahead with the program, and I'm very happy to introduce our second keynote speaker for today. She has come on stage. There is Ruth. So I'm very happy and also very proud that with the Against Africa platform for this symposium, we have our fantastic invited speaker, Ruth Nyambura, who is a Kenyan ecofeminist and researcher. She's working on the intersections of ecological justice in Africa, and she's an activist that she uses a feminist political ecology perspective to engage with Africa's global food systems and amplifying the revolutionary work of smallholder farmers in Africa, the majority of whom are women, as well as rural agrarian movements offering concrete anti-capitalist alternatives to the ecological, economic, and democratic crises facing the continent. We are very happy to have you with us. Ruth will, as you can see in the program, she will have her talk today with us on feminist ecologies in Africa, tracing the vernaculars of liberating the gendered commons. Welcome, and I just give you the floor. Before we start, just a practical announcement. I will leave the stage and the audience can put their questions in the chat during the talk, and we will try to end on time so that we still have some room for Q&A. So you are all free to put your questions in the chat. The floor is yours, Ruth. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me. Just have to warn everyone that it's 4 p.m. in Nairobi right now, and children are back from school. So if you hear any shouting and screaming, I'm very safe. It's children being children. So I will not reintroduce myself again because the introduction has already been made. And I will basically just go straight into my presentation today. And it's basically, in a nutshell, my presentation tries to relitigate the histories of ecology and the agrarian commons on the continent of Africa, but of course looking at, three particular waves and periods of resistance. So the anti-imperialist movements in Africa, the new movements fighting against the onset of structural adjustment programs, and then the present ecofeminist movements on the continent. So basically looking at these three waves of resistance, not as discontinuities, but looking at the continuities of these movements. So let me just share my screen. So the title of my talk today is Feminist Ecologies of Africa, Tracing the Vernaculars and Cultures of Liberation of the Gendered Commons. And it's going to be a bit text heavy. So tracing the long histories, 3 political generations of resistance by African women over the struggles over the gendered commons. So anti-colonial and anti-imperialist movements in Africa cannot be fully understood outside of the earlier struggles that were waged by African women against the colonial decimation of their livelihoods, communities, productive and reproductive resources. Women were also central in the colonial political economy and constituted the conditions of possibility for the migrant labor economy that supported the process of primitive accumulation through their dispossession. Lena Some notes the centrality of African women's resistance to anti-colonial struggles by stating that their demands regarding the control over fertility provided a basis upon which anti-colonial and anti-imperialist rebellions grew, even as the latter may not have constituted women's overt claims. While modern ecological and agrarian struggles in Africa were surfaced materially in relation to anti-colonial resistance against primitive accumulation and dispossession, the accounting of these struggles has generally glozed over the critical role that women played in these battles and has largely been devoted to the wholesale relocation onto nationalist demands. This subsumption of women-led anti-colonial eco-agrarian struggles in Africa within anti-imperialist and nationalist frameworks, analytical structures which, while crucially important, have long and continue to be prone to a masculinist hyperfocus and have tended to overlook the very gendered nature and reverberations of the liberatory thought and praxis over the struggles over the gendered ecological agrarian commons led by these women's movements. In addition, this containment of women's histories of resistance, chiefly and liberally within the dominant frameworks of anti-imperialism and nationalism, fails to fully capture the grounded imperatives that precipitated them, and importantly, the continuities and discontinuities of these earlier struggles, as espoused by the present ecological feminist movements in Africa. The term gendered ecological agrarian commons is used here to refer to those places in the world in which women and men live in common within elaborated subsistence relations, far from or actively rejecting the coercive policies of commodification, as well as both building and defending alternatives to socially and ecologically destructive global corporate capitalism. With the advent of structural adjustment programs from the late 1970s, not too long after most countries had gained independence from colonial rule, African women's anti-colonial struggles were transformed into fierce class-gendered, even ethnicized battles against neoliberal globalization across the continent. These new forms of resistance from below against the World Bank and IMF's policies symbolize not a departure, but distinct continuities with women's anti-colonial struggles against the capitalist enclosures of the gendered commons. The inheritance of colonialism and these contemporary neo-colonial economic and geopolitical processes, as well as the progression of the histories and experiences of exploitation, opened up a new historical continuity of a wave of active resistance across the continent and the rest of the global South. Structural adjustment programs produced particular conditions within which multinational corporations, in conjunction with, as well as national governments, orchestrated and supported violence in both urban and rural areas of Africa. The spaces, productive and reproductive, within which women and poor people in Africa operated in, came under particularly severe attacks as the state sought to both control and curtail in the process of implementing the conditionalities imposed by these policies. At the same time, these same conditions of exploitation helped shape new resistance battles by African women, as can be seen by various popular movements that sprang up in the 80s and the 90s. Some important examples during this key period include the mass mobilizations by women in the Niger Delta, the Ogarefe 1984 and the ECPAN in 1986, women's uprisings, which were against privatization, multinational oil corporations such as Shell, state violence and militarization, and importantly, against oil extraction and in defense of their land and territories. Leigh Brownhill borrows Giovanni Arrighi's framework of the long 20th century by excavating and critically examining what she describes as an unbroken century-long chain of social movements led by African women against capitalist enclosures of the gendered commons in Africa. Using both of these analytical approaches, one can argue decisively that these two waves of women-led resistance mentioned here have opened up space and insights to the present wave of struggles for the gendered commons being witnessed on the continent. The new movements that we witness at present are primarily housed within a climate justice framework, although others abound, such as food sovereignty, and are led by many self-described ecofeminist activists and collectives. Two groups stand out in particular: the Women Alliance and the Southern African Rural Women's Assembly. Both are transnational in nature, working across several African countries, and with strong internationalist links with academia, anti-extractive, anti-privatization, unions, climate and environmental justice, indigenous, food sovereignty, landless peoples, and peasant social movements, as well as non-governmental organizations. Importantly, they also espouse strong anti-capitalist and feminist politics, or at the very least, their politics are contained within the vast canon of progressive and anti-patriarchal gender politics. These movements and collectives in Africa often attempt to employ a historical materialist approach to both understand and interlink ecological questions with gendered and economic ones. The two earlier struggles, the anti-imperialist struggles and the anti-neoliberal globalization movements, waged over the gendered commons mentioned here, inform the present battles that collectives such as WOMIN and Southern African Rural Women's Assembly battle with, and the strategies they consider, as they consider them, the antecedents to their own, interrelated, and basically a long history still unfolding, and whose materiality arises out of the same processes of global accumulation and dispossession, thus lending much credence to the analytical approach being proposed by Brownhill, that of a long and broken chain of resistance by African women. So how do we make sense of the histories of resistance that we see presently on the continent of Africa? What are the vernaculars? What are the cultures of liberation over the gendered agrarian commons in Africa? What are the justificatory premises, including the material realities that informed and activated this cultures of liberation of women's movements for the gendered commons in Africa? What do these vernaculars and cultures reveal about the ways in which these movements conceived and experienced power? What do they tell us about women's claims over the gendered commons across generations? And how did this inform, or how does this inform their counter-hegemonic strategies, as well as their conceptions of the pluriverse and cosmologies of freedom? So what are the continuities and discontinuities across generations? And this is very key because there's a tendency to look at present movements around climate justice, around food sovereignty, around seed sovereignty, basically as arriving on the doorstep, as if history does not exist, as if these are movements that are not grounded in the colonial afterlives and in long, long histories of resistance on this continent. And what do they reveal about the nature, the transnational and international, of the political economy and political ecology from which they emerge from across time? Because the continent is part of the international. And also borrowing, if we're to borrow the political concepts of imagined communities from Benedict Anderson and Communities of Resistance by Chandra Mohanty, what modes of travel, co-creation and pastiche, the biocultural, corporeal, symbolic, spiritual, material, and cosmological have been mobilized across generations, across these three generations of movements, of African women's movements, and especially across borders, because as mentioned, the anti-colonial struggles were, worked across borders, struggles against, neoliberal globalization, and the climate justice movement, as evidenced by the present movements, work across borders. These are not simply local or national movements or demands or questions or issues, but they have proven to be, working across borders, to be internationalist, to be regional questions. So I'm thinking about these three periods as archives and rituals in conversation with one another. If we are to look at the anti-colonial women's movements, then anti-neoliberal globalization movements and the present movements, if we're to think about them as archives and rituals, how does a politics of liberation emerge, specifically as oppositional consciousness, as moving archives of co-created strategies of resistance, as collective identity, and then as solidarity practiced by African women across time, across generations? And finally, what have been the limits and possibilities of these transcripts of resistance across political generations to structurally undermine patriarchy and the processes of capitalist accumulation of the commons in Africa. So so basically, I leave that presentation with those particular questions, because it is history still unfolding. If we look at the long histories and we think about the politics of ecology in Africa, not just in terms of climate change or climate justice, but thinking about, questions around the agrarian commons, situating women's resistance beyond anti-imperialist struggles, beyond nationalist frameworks, which, while important, have long subsumed, women's particular motives and histories of resistance, and the ways they conceive power, the ways in which they conceive borders, the ways in which they conceive the internationalist politics, the ways in which they have been able to think about vernaculars, borrowing from each other, not just within, national borders or local borders, but borrowing cultures of resistance, cultures of revolution across the borders of this continent. So I will leave the presentation with this particular questions for us to think with in the question and answer section. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth, for this presentation. We had foreseen a lot more time for this keynote talk. We actually had an hour. So before we maybe go into the Q&A, maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on, because you ended now with this idea of the trends, I mean, the power of working transborder and like connecting these different historices of struggle within the continent. But you also mentioned in the beginning the global character of it and how it also can link beyond the territorial global south. So I would also be interested like in what kind of opportunities and power there is also in that global connections, which can also link up to, anti-neoliberal forms of dispossessions globally, also in the territorial global north.
We'll start, one of the things that was very important to think about, and in terms of working across political, and I call them political, not just generations, but working across political generations, there's a tendency to think about, as I said earlier in the presentation, there's a tendency to think about this particular period, or to basically infantilize, well, of course, because of, long racist ideas, there's a tendency to infantilize the continent, but also there's a tendency to, project and a particular, not just a white gaze, but also a very masculinist and patriarchal gaze in terms of looking at women's resistance and women's forms of resistance. So the first thing to think about in terms of the global, so it is to situate, enclosures of the commons are not particular to the continent of Africa. This, not even just particular to the global south. The enclosures of the commons, have a long history across the world. And when you look at specifically movements like I've mentioned, the Southern African Rural Women's Assembly, WOMAN, but even just going back to, anti-colonial resistance and anti-colonial struggles in the ways in which they conceived power, because you're thinking about, colonial powers that don't just have one colony in Kenya or in Uganda or in Tanzania. These are countries, these are colonizers working across different geographical spaces, right? So then the impetus for resistance, means linking up, thinking about a politics of solidarity, right? And so a politics of solidarity, means that, to break down the colonial boundaries, the colonial ideas of borders, and to think about power, going beyond the limited space locally, going beyond the limited space nationally, but thinking about borders in a much more fluid way, thinking about power in a much more fluid and expansive manner. So that was very key in both these 3 waves of movement and struggles. And to give a very specific example, one of the things that has been happening on the continent in the last, one of the biggest struggles on the continent right now, across the continent, we've been witnessing for the last decade, the passing of legislation criminalizing the rights of smallholder and peasant farmers to save, sell, and exchange their seeds. Also, in the last 10, 15 years, the new green revolution, the 20th century green revolution has finally, that can be nuanced, finally arrived on the continent of Africa, where what is being pushed basically by organizations such as the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa, strong intellectual property rights around seed, strong private property, private property ideas around land, commodification of land. And this has been happening, and what we're calling another land rush on the continent of Africa, for example. And so what it has meant is that because this legislation is not just being passed in Kenya, in the parliament in Kenya, or in the parliament in Uganda. Regional economic commissions such as, the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, COMESA, or the East African Community, EAC, the parliaments of the regional economic commissions are passing legislation that affects whole regions on the continent. And so it has meant that, movements cannot just struggle or resist within their own national boundaries, national colonial boundaries. It has meant that, groups have to come together. They have to be collectives working across borders, because capital doesn't recognize borders or boundaries. And so it has meant that, to adopt strategies of resistance against enclosures, against neoliberal politics, against seed and trade laws that criminalize, farmer activities that are as old, as the world or the universe itself. So that is the thing. It has meant a rethinking or a shift, but also a long continuation from the anti-colonial resistance of how do we resist, in conjunction, in solidarity with others. So that is how I can basically answer that question, thinking about the present moment, but borrowing from the past, because history is always unfolding.
Thank you, and I think also very empowering messages here. There are some questions in the chat. I will briefly scroll. So first, a kind of analytical question: what is the advantage of developing a specific feminist ecological movement rather than joining the merely human ecological movement? So what is the particular, empowering advantage of that specific feminist approach?
I find that question particularly fascinating, because for the longest time, Black people are not considered human. Even the term human is very, very political. Who was considered human for the longest time? Certainly not Black people during, colonization, during, transatlantic slave trade. And also thinking about women also, for a really long time, women were not really, the idea of human has often meant, a particular kind of person, and mostly white, mostly male. So the contribution to a feminist ecological movement, its contribution is the fact that, so I think about feminism, or like a gendered analysis, as a framework of analysis, not a politics of a binary, for example, if you're to look at in a very narrow sense, a politics of men and women, but actually an analytical framework for us to be able to further excavate the ways in which power operates. So a feminist ecological movement, goes further in terms of thinking about the position of women, but not just thinking about the position of women, thinking about the politics of race, thinking about the politics of class, thinking about, opening up and excavating, the question around, indigeneity for example, thinking about social reproduction, questions around labor. So this is what, for me, I believe is the significance of a feminist approach, and not merely a human ecological movement. Because again, the question of human is something that has been contested and continues to be contested. And even if you look at the space right now, there's a reason why peasant women on the continent of Africa, smallholder women farmers who produce the majority of the food that is eaten on this continent, but still having to deal with legislation being passed that essentially criminalizes, both their productive and their reproductive labor. So even just that even opens up, the question of human. Who is human? Who is seen as worthy? So a feminist analytical framework, or a gendered analytical framework, allows us to critically think about power. Power over who has the power? What does power mean? How does power travel, politically, socially, culturally, economically? So I think that is the beauty of, a feminist analysis, or a feminist framework, especially on the politics of ecology, or agrarian politics, or climate change.
Thank you. And I personally totally agree with that. It's interesting, of course, as you know, Ruth, we are here with a very interdisciplinary audience, and how power works in those social, political, and ecological worlds might be more common sense for some in some, academic debates than in others. So it's very good to also clarify beyond those disciplinary borders. There is also, of course, within the broader topic of this symposium, there is also a specific question on how to connect this to climate change scenarios, so to the broader dynamics of climate change. Was the question asked by David.
David Ojo. Okay, so one of the things is that you'll notice that in my presentation, I use the term, and I borrowed this term from Leigh Brownhill, agrarian commons. And I think I've in several conversations, I often say this. I find the term climate change very, very limiting. It's very neutral. The climate is changing, and I understand the necessity of having a terminology in which, can be shared, especially in an international context. But I think it's a term that obscures power, obscures what exactly is happening, obscures historical responsibility around the climate crisis as we find ourselves in. So I normally tend to stray away from using the term climate change unless I really, really have to use the term climate change. So when you think about, I would maybe flip that question a bit, David, and basically, for to talk about climate change, what are we talking about? When we talk about, resources, for example, when we talk about seeds, when we talk about land, when we talk about water, when we talk about labor, when we talk about the power of transnational corporations, when we talk about militarization, when we talk about pollution, when we talk about the power of the state. So this is how, I like to open up the conversation around climate change. What exactly are we talking about? What is the materiality here? What are the material bases? What are people struggling over? What are peasant movements struggling over? What are communities in the Niger Delta whose land has been polluted by Shell for the last 60 years? What are they actually struggling over? Because then it allows us to be very, very clear about what power is, what we are struggling against, but also allows us to think about, common visions of liberation, common visions of justice. So again, going back to, what are the feminist, what are feminist ideas of, of justice? If you asked, peasant farmer in Muranga, not too far away from where I'm sitting right now, right? It would be, being able to, being able to farm, being able to own their seeds, being able to access land, historical land questions, thinking about historical land questions, especially on this continent. So for me, and especially as an African woman and sitting on this continent, I have to open it up. What does climate change mean? When we talk about flooding, when we talk about people being kicked out of home, when we talk about, climate refugees, or people dying in the watery graves of the Mediterranean because the land is not productive anymore, because it's owned by the elite or owned by transnational corporations. This is, for me, what a feminist analysis does. It unpacks what climate change is. So my entry point is not the term climate change. It is useful. I understand the utility of the term, but then I would have to unpack it.
Thank you very much, and I think it also relates very much to the question that was asked by Dinkayehu. But let's go to another question that was asked, like more question for some concrete illustrations. So Luce was asking the question, if you can give some examples of concrete gendered commons that you think have been able to foster change, and the recent initiatives that they organized.
I'll give. I have.
You have already referred to some, but I think for us to have an idea of
yes. So I will go back to something that I've touched on a little bit, talking about the recent developments on the continent in which, there's a push, to basically copy paste. Actually, these are laws actually modeled in Europe first, and there's an attempt to copy paste, strong intellectual property rights over seeds. Especially in order to basically give multinational seed, agribusiness corporations a foothold on the continent. So going back to what I mentioned, two present transnational feminist movements on the continent. The first is WOMEN, and the second one is the Southern African Rural Women's Assembly. And let me talk about the Southern African Rural Women's Assembly. It works across 7 countries in Southern Africa, from South Africa, Lesotho, Mozambique, Zambia, Malawi, and majority, its membership is basically mostly women in rural areas in these countries. Majority of them are also smallholder or peasant farmers. And one of the things that they have done, despite the fact that legislation, this strong legislation, it's not just legislation that is being passed. This legislation says that parts of the legislation basically say that, if you're found with uncertified seeds, you pay very hefty fines. In Kenya, the fines are up to $10,000. $10,000, you can imagine what that means. Charging, $10,000 to smallholder farmers if they are caught with uncertified seeds. And of course, this says something. And so the Southern African Rural Women's Assembly has been able to not only, it's an act of resistance also, in terms of having seed banks, the passing on of, historical knowledge around seeds. So this has been spread, working across 7 countries, also pushing for, sending delegations, reading around the policies, taking specific governments to court. So this is an example, concrete examples of the ways in which African women are resisting, and not just African women, because also I want to say that, when we talk about agrarian commons, we really have to talk about, rural areas, and the status of women in rural areas. And very many parts of Africa, remain impoverished because by post-colonial governments, but also continue to be, sites of extraction. When you look at, the policies, but also when you look at, the land rush that we've seen on the continent in the last 15 years, it is largely happening in rural areas of Africa. So this says something that, women from 7 countries in Southern Africa coming together to resist the corporate takeover of their seeds, challenging their governments in court, but also mobilizing, having feminist political schools, having political education, but importantly, also organizing, with, unions. For example, we've seen this in South Africa, especially, is a really good example, of farmers' movements, agrarian movements, coming together with unions, over specific issues, so also seeing the cross movement work. And this is how, like, I would, in terms of like thinking about the agrarian commons and thinking about resistance, it's not just transnational resistance, but it is also cross-movement resistance. Different groups and organizations and collectives coming together to resist, not just resist the onslaught of, the neoliberal takeover of their land and their seeds and their water, but also crafting alternative visions, pushing for food sovereignty, pushing for agroecology, not just in practice, but also pushing for it to be, in terms of like government policy and getting government support over it. So these are just some of the examples, concrete and beautiful expressions of resistance and solidarity over the agrarian commons in Africa.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. There is also this question of Evaristo, who is asking an interesting question about the positionality of those struggles and that particular feminist movement in terms of, so do you think there has been both resistance but also sometimes incorporation or collaboration? So in other words, is there a single gaze on ecofeminism in the African continent?
So, feminism is, and this is not just peculiar or particular to Africa. Feminism is very, very controversial everywhere, across the world. So one thing to say is that, and even I mentioned it in my presentation, a number of these movements, many of them call themselves eco-feminist movements, like warming, for example, which works across almost all the regions in Africa. They call themselves an ecofeminist movement. I quote a paper in my presentation by the Southern African Rural Women's Assembly, in fact, in where they deal with the question around, do they call themselves feminist? Not everyone calls themselves feminist, and of course, we always have to be very careful about imposing. Just because a practice seems feminist, we have to be careful to not impose the term feminist on a particular group or a particular entity. So of course, there's a lot of discussion and conversation around that. Not to get too theoretical, but of course, there's quite different strands of feminism. One of the strands to think about, La Via Campesina, which is the largest peasant movement across the world, actually considered the largest social movement across the world, advocates for peasant feminism, right? So even just one of the things in my presentation also to think about, this movement that I talk about espouse anti-capitalist politics. So this is not liberal stands of feminism, but particular feminism that are internationalist in nature, anti-capitalist in nature, which of course shapes their struggles, but also shapes their ideas. So these movements, for example, are opposed to the commodification of land, private markets around land, opposed to the commodification of seeds, the corporate control over seeds. And this is important to think about, right? Not just the movements themselves, but the politics and the ideology of these movements. So these are very, very critical. Of course, a lot of conversations, conversations, critiques and counter critiques of what does a feminist politics mean on this, continent. Is everything feminist? Not everything is feminist, even if it may espouse some feminist traits. So that's a bit more in terms of like more theoretical in terms of thinking about what is feminist, what is not. You know, how do people articulate that, not just their feminist politics, but their radical gender politics. But in addition to that, these movements don't operate in isolation to, you know, it's not just peasant women, they're peasant men, they're smallholder male farmers on the continent of Africa. So it's not just women, it's just that, you know, they have crafted spaces for themselves. But even they're part of wider networks, they're part of wider movements, you know, where there are obviously conversations about what is a feminist politics for us. So I guess that's the ways in which I would think about it.
Thank you very much. I want to go to Nyanchama's question, which is an interesting question in the trajectories, historical, but also future trajectories of those vernaculars, and the empowering, but also the dangers that lie in that. So her question really is, when you look at that history of the structural adjustment programs and World Bank imposed restrictions that paved the way for gender-focused development policies, whereby women, also really central, were forced to shoulder the very negative impacts and the critical breakdown of that social infrastructure of the gendered commons. Do you think that this history is repeating itself or can repeat itself in the wake of this increasing focus today on ecofeminism, whereby women knowledge resources are now hailed as being the most efficacious solution? So I think this is a really interesting question to also look into the diversity of directions in which this can bring us.
That's a very fascinating question. In fact, you know, we have a joke, you know, within the ecofeminist and movements on the continent, you know, around how, you know, women become this, you know, it's sort of like it's a romanticization of women's knowledge, but also a romanticization of labor, where, you know, the whole idea of like, you know, it's the whole thing. I mean, women know this across the world also, where everybody on Mother's Day, for example, everyone writes a beautiful post about their mother or the women in their lives, that they're fantastic, they're great, they take care of the babies, they do ABCD, you know. So the thanks basically becomes this very long letter, you know, but no real structural transformation actually takes place. So you're right about that in terms of we have to be very careful, you know, and one of the reasons why there was a need even just for a feminist or an ecofeminist analysis within the wider agrarian struggles and movements on the continent is that many of us, many movements, you know, in the spaces felt that, you know, there would be this talk around the fact that women in Africa produce the majority of the food that is, you know, is consumed, for example. Women do A, women do B, women do C, you know, and also sort of paternalistic attempts to protect women from the state, from multinational corporations, and from patriarchy, but very little, you know, transformation around, can women access land? Are women able to access these resources, and at whose terms? You know, who mediates or what mediates the ways in which women in Africa, especially peasant women farmers or smallholder farmers, are able to access these resources? And this is why the analysis comes into play, because ecofeminist analysis is not about romanticization. You know, not just an ecofeminist, even a feminist political ecology within the long canon of feminist geography, feminist political ecology, or basically feminist analysis around resources. It's not to romanticize, you know, women or the idea of women or the idea of women's labor. You know, an ecofeminist analysis is about power. It is about dismantling oppressive power structures, patriarchy, capitalism, you know, the power of multinational corporations like Bayer, Syngenta, and whatnot. You know, it is dismantling the oppressive power of the state. So this is not a feel-good club where, women, they provide the food, they do ABCD. No, it's not. This is a serious political undertaking of what oppressive power looks like, and what power, what visions of liberation are necessary for not just peasant women farmers on the continent, but thinking about the oppression of women continentally, but of course, not just the oppression of women, how, when you think about intersectionality, the ways in which power operates across scale, across time, across class, across gender and whatnot. So that is the very fast part. All right, but then the first part of the part of your question where you asked about structural adjustment programs, that's a very important question, because in the last, especially with the pandemic that we're facing right now, what we've seen is the response is, in my own country, in Kenya, we were saying that we're sort of back to the 1980s and the late 1970s, because we have all these loans coming in and massive rounds of retrenchment, the state moving back, and the power of corporations and the private sector really being felt in the last 2 years. And it's not just Kenya. This has been witnessed in the last 2 years across the continent. So it's not just a pandemic that we are facing, but we're also facing sort of a return of adjustment, structural adjustment, policies and politics. And so we always say this, ecofeminist politics is not an attempt to supplant the role of the state. We can have 1 million seed banks, which are very important in terms of a politics of resistance and strategy and tactics. But at the end of the day, we need, to think about land questions, to think about wider questions, for example, agrarian transformation. Someone has written in the comment section around South Africa, for example, where right now, almost 30 years after independence, land in South Africa is much more concentrated than it was, during the apartheid period. So the question around, it's not just about how to feed people. It's not just about climate. It's not just about seeds. These are deep, deep questions around transforming, systems in total. So this is not, ecofeminist politics is not an attempt to supplant the role of the state, but is an attempt to engage and to push the state and to transform the state in much more liberatory ways, because the state, especially the inherited colonial state, as we have it across this continent, serves the elites, serves multinational and transnational capital and corporations, and it serves capitalism. It does not serve the people. It does not serve the majority of the people. So these are not simply policy questions or technical questions or scientific questions. These are deeply structural and political questions.
Thank you very much. And I think indeed a very, very interesting reference indeed to the current pandemic times, where stateness and how the state comes into being is again very much magnified, not only in the African continent, but worldwide. There was another question on the more spatial characteristics or infrastructural material dimensions of these gendered commons. And if you could also give an example of the urban commons, to shift a little bit that spatial narratives on the gendered commons. Thank you.
All right, so I'll start with, actually start with the urban commons, and this is very, very interesting in that at this particular moment in Nairobi, where I'm based, we have a really, we've had a movement in the last 2 years, literally occupying any idle space, whether it's private, whether it's public, just basically occupying the space and growing food. and especially in, informal settlements or shack settlements, and growing food for local communities. So one of the things when you think about the commons, because the commons, I like to think of this is how we describe the commons, it's basically a step higher than the public. Right, so of course, when you think about the histories of the commons, especially as elaborated by Sylvia Federici's work, long, histories around the commons, to think about, what has been available to us, what has been taken away, not just by the private sector or the private market or private politics, but also what the state has taken for itself, what is no longer available to us. People talk about urban food gardens as urban commons. Again, it's much more to be said about the ways in which very many parts urban food gardens basically emerge in particularly gentrifying ways in particular spaces, or emerge as middle class pet projects, rather than really trying to reclaim the public, reclaim what is available. And so that is what is different, for example, from what I'm saying from the movements that have emerged, led by the poor and working class of Nairobi, not just engaging in projects, not seeing the urban, the food gardens in Nairobi that they're taking. It's not just about growing food, but it is about remaking of space. Who owns what? Why does this entity own this? In a city where around 60%, 70% of the people in Nairobi live on 13% of the land, right? Well, a small majority owns something like almost 70% of the land. So then when we think about the commons, it's not just about projects. It's not just about policies. It is about a remaking and reshifting, for example, relationship to the land, the relationship to space. So not just as urban middle class projects. So this, in terms of, this speaks both to the infrastructure, again, going back to rural space, because we have seen attempts at, especially with the new green revolution in Africa being pushed by, what are they called? I have to remember the name, philanthro-capitalist organizations such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, pushing for agriculture, pushing for investment of agriculture in rural areas on the continent. But the terms of it, reveal something very, very different. This is not about the remaking of power and, tipping the power balance back to, squatters, peasant farmers, who have a long history of dispossession from the colonial period. But this is basically an attempt to further, not just commodify, but consolidate land in the hands of a few elites, but also in the hands of corporations. So when I think about, infrastructure, when I think about that, it's about what relationships are being remade. How are women able to access space? And space is very political for women, for indigenous people, for people living with disabilities, for indigenous people. Space is very, very political. So this is how I think about, the spatial and infrastructural dimensions. So it's not just about projects. It's not just about investing $1 million in agriculture in Africa by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, but investing in agriculture that locks out smallholder farmers, consolidates land, consolidates the resources, water, forests, consolidates it in the hands of a local elite, but also corporations. So when I think about infrastructure, when I think about, spatial politics, I think about power. What is being remade? To what end? Who benefits? Who has power over? Who loses? So I think for me, that is what the beauty of, thinking about the commons, thinking about the gendered commons, but also this is what an ecofeminist or a feminist ecology politics does. It gives us more tools. These are not the only tools, but they give us even better tools to think about politics of power, when it comes to the commons: land, water, seeds, space, relationships with one another. Because climate justice, agrarian justice, food sovereignty, these are not technical projects. This is also a remaking of the ways in which we relate with the earth and the ways in which we relate with one another.
Thank you so much, and I'm very happy that this last question also brought us to really think about all these aspects and how they also push us to go beyond these dichotomies and think in these terms of claims, reappropriation, the struggle against dispossession, beyond the borders of the South and the North. The urban and the rural, the past and the present. So I'm very happy with this last intervention. Thank you very much for this fascinating discussion. We really, really enjoyed. We are very grateful. Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Ruth. A big last round of applause. I'm sorry, it all has to be virtual.
Thank you so much to everyone. The questions were so rich. I will share the presentation, obviously.
Great. Thank you so much.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.